Welcome back to Generative AI and the Delivery of Legal Services. Today we're going to be talking about prompt engineering and RAG. That stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation. And we'll be jumping into how the mindset really is everything, prompt engineering 101, retrieval augmented generation, and then fact-checking and validating results. So first, and most importantly, mindset is everything. I may have spoken about this before in class, but AI is not a magic oracle. And I really think that misapprehension and misexpectation of AI has led to a lot of bad results, like the Schwartz case. In fact, what AI is a helpful assistant. And if you view it that way, then you'll know that it's not perfect. Just like an assistant, it can make mistakes, and then you need to review it to make sure that it's corrected. Prompt Engineering 101. We're going to go through a whirlwind introduction to prompt engineering. First off, a prompt is, in ordinary life, to make something happen, but within computer programming, it's to give an instruction to a computer using natural language rather than computer programming language to accomplish some goal. A naive prompt is one where it's somewhat literal in what you're asking for. For example, draft lease. No meat to it, no context, just draft lease. And I've been guilty of this. I think everyone who initially starts with generative AI is guilty of this. You think it's as easy as that. And we find out pretty quickly that you could ask it in that generic a fashion, but then you get a very generic, unhelpful output from the AI. And it's the same thing as if you talked, and it's a helpful exercise to think, if you talk to a normal human being and said, draft lease, they, like this character, would be quite confused. You know, what kind of lease are you talking about? Who's this with? Who's the client? Who's the person on the other side? What's the term of years? Is there a clause that prevents them from having pets as a tenant? All kinds of questions. And so all of those questions, all of the answers to those questions is context. And just like we as human beings need context, so does the AI. So an informed prompt is one that includes more of the context. It benefits from that information, and it gives the AI direction, format, and describes the expectations of what you have in mind about what you're asking for. If we break down a request, you can see first off, a lot of context here. It's talking about the term of years, the type of lease. Is it commercial, residential? This is residential. What's the jurisdiction? How much is the security deposit? Are there restrictions against pets or subleases? And so on. And so an informed prompt includes all of this information that's very helpful to the objective, which is to draft a lease. And just like a person, the AI is very much pleased with this additional information because now it knows what you want and it could better carry out your wishes. So prompt engineering is a few things, but the two most important is that it's a way of designing and refining your requests to get what you want, and also a way of avoiding mistakes. Prompt engineering is simply good communication. Just like good communication is helpful in real life when people are trying to explain things to each other, in particular if a partner or an older attorney is trying to describe what they want. For an associate or an intern, it's very helpful for the attorney to provide as much detail as possible so that you can meet their expectations. It also works for AI. And so prompt engineering as a way of avoiding mistakes, let's break that down. Let's look at a few mistakes and how we can correct them. So the first is poor direction. It's just not clear what you want. You know, a common mistake is providing vague direction like we saw with draft lease. So here's an example. Tell me about the law, far too vague, no direction, but can you please explain to me eviction laws for a tenant in Alaska, focusing on their rights when facing eviction due to unpaid rent. Much more specific, some conditions that apply, some facts that apply, and a jurisdiction that applies. So the AI is able to pinpoint what you're asking for and provide you a much more pinpoint answer. Mistake number 2 is missing examples. It's very helpful to an AI for you to give it an example of what you're looking for. And when you provide that, you could do a much better job. So for example, here, it's extremely vague, draft a legal memo, but if you give it an example of, you want it to have a memo-like introduction where it says to so-and-so, from so-and-so, Ray, like what is the subject of it, and then maybe begin with a summary of the conclusion of the legal memo. This is the type of format that you would want it to follow. And so giving an example helps greatly. Another is ignoring format completely. If you don't set clear expectations of what you're looking for, the AI won't know what it is you want. So for example, here, in this legal memo, you want to set the format to not exceed 5 double-spaced pages, identify the issue, the rule, application, conclusion, IRAC. And so by providing it with that format, it could provide you legal analysis that is very clear and structured. Whereas if you don't provide it, it's going to give you a very generic, flat response. Number 4 is overlooking evaluation. If you don't set criteria by which you can judge the output, then it's going to be unclear if those expectations are met. And the AI won't know what to deliver on to make sure that you're satisfied. Another mistake, the last one, is you just make it too complicated. If you put everything that you want in one jumbled prompt, it's a little difficult for the AI to work through all of that. So what you can do is break it down into chunks, break it down into multiple steps, where you define the first step, and then the next step, and the step after that. That algorithm or recipe that we talked about before, where you can clearly communicate to the AI what it is you're looking for. And so this is also referred to as chain of thought, which you may remember has come into play as a main part of reasoning models, of thinking things through step by step with a chain of reasoning. This is intended, though, for a predictive model where you're simply asking it to think through step by step how it's going to perform the prompt that you've asked for. A prompt framework is a structured approach. It's kind of like IRAC. Think of how you use that. Issue, rule, application, conclusion. It's a nice mnemonic that helps you to remember that structure. In the same way, a prompt framework is a device that you use to obtain structure within a request. The components of a prompt framework are that it introduces context, it gives background information to the AI so that it can start with a good basis, foundation of information. 2 is it gives it guidance, clear and specific directions about what to do. An example of the kind of output that you're looking for, format with rules and limitations to ensure that the responses are within your expectations. And finally, evaluation criteria so that it can gauge if what it's providing to you as output is actually falling within the quality and relevance that you're looking for. And so there's different frameworks, but each of these components pretty much applies to all of the different types of frameworks. One framework that we'll talk about in this micro lecture, the reading material goes into much more detail about alternative frameworks, but this one is a pretty basic one, RTF, or Role Task Format. So as you can see in this template, you instruct the AI to act in a certain role, then you give it a task to perform, and then request that it be provided within a certain format. So here's an example of that. Act like a lawyer with 30 years of experience in litigating. Give me a plan to improve my trial skills, and in table format. So you got the role, you got the task, and then the format of it being provided within the table. And then you could see that ChatGPT, and this is a predictive model, 4.0, it thinks it through and provides this table showing a timeline by which you can prepare yourself to be a better litigator with an improvement of your trial skills and what you would do within each activity, and also evaluation methods to assess your performance. And as I mentioned, there's more advanced prompt frameworks that are available in your reading. Meta prompting is a bit of a more advanced use of prompting where you're essentially asking the AI to optimize your prompt. You could start out with something like draft lease if you have to, but you can ask the AI to ask you follow-up questions to improve your prompt, and then it provides you with a more refined prompt that you could use with it or with another LLM. Another application of that very same concept is Anthropic's prompt generator. And so what you could do with that is you could enter something like a naive prompt, like draft lease, and then it breaks it down in exquisite detail. How does it do this? It does this because it has plenty of prompts that it has been prompted with, and it can also identify related concepts to a lease and then use all of that to create a more informed prompt. And as you can see here, it anticipates and goes into a lot of detail on some of the facts that we would have provided for a lease, maintenance and repairs, even parking policies, and a landlord's right to enter. So when you see this, you might think, all right, why did we learn all of that about prompt engineering when we could just use this prompt generator to create a prompt? Well, it's still very important to think clearly with an AI or in the real world. And so creating prompts and making them in a very sophisticated and clear way is still a skill that you need. Let's talk about retrieval augmented generation. Now, it sounds complicated, it has a terrible acronym, but this is how it fits into everything that we're talking about. We started off at the bottom with a model with a AI like ChatGPT. Now, just using ChatGPT by itself is good. You know, when it answers your questions, it's relying on its general training that got it to that point. And we know that there's a cutoff date in terms of the training, so it's not always going to have up-to-date information. But it does a pretty good job of answering your questions and doing what you want. It could be like drafting a page or two. Not too bad. One step above that is when you employ appropriate prompts based upon what you've learned about prompt engineering. You could make much more informed requests where you set expectations, you provide a format, and you give it a lot of context. But even better than just relying on your prompting skills is when you could employ retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, which you see at the top of the pyramid here. Now, the big difference and what makes it so much better is that RAG is always tied to a reliable source of truth, source documents that are reviewed and accurate. And so when those documents are introduced to the AI, it could provide much more informed, up-to-date answers and output based upon that documentation. This is what a naive RAG pipeline works like. It's called naive RAG because it's very simple. In fact, it's the most simple implementation of RAG. And this is how it works. The user asks a question. Then that question is used to determine the subject matter, the keywords that are being asked about. Let's say it is a lease. And then the AI looks into the documents that it has connected to it. So let's say it has a library of leases. It would look through those leases and it would find references that are the most relevant and similar to the term that's being asked about. So let's say there's a question about a residential lease. well, then it will only look through the documents looking specifically for references to a residential lease and pull out, retrieve, as you see here, the text that is relevant to residential leases. And it could be 10, 20, 30 different references within the source documents that talk about residential leases. It will pull up typically the top 10. And those top 10 chunks of information about residential leases will be pulled into the context, which is combined with the user's question and fed into an LLM. So one way to think about it is that the AI is essentially having an open book test where it knows the question, it has all of the potential answers served up from the documents, and then based with all of that in front of it, it can then answer the question. A more complicated version, and by the way, for enhanced RAG, there are many, many different variations of this and flavors that improve on different aspects of it. But this is how it would work. The user asks a question, and in this particular RAG pipeline, it breaks down that one question into, in this case, 3 sub-questions. Now, why would you do that? You might do that because it's a compound question. You might do it because the question you're asking implies an answer to an implied question. And so this breaking down of a question into sub-questions is called query decomposition. And by breaking down one question into sub-questions, you can retrieve more relevant chunks of information from the documents. And then based on that retrieved context, you re-rank the retrieved context according to its relevance. Remember how I said before that it would grab the top 10 pieces of context? Well, what you could do is instead of just grabbing 10, you can grab 20 pieces of relevant context, but then rank them on which ones are the most relevant. That's something that isn't done in naive RAG. But in this type of pipeline, an enhanced type of RAG, you can not only retrieve more, but then you can re-rank it so that you only have maybe the top most relevant pieces of context and just take the top 5. But now those are the most enriched pieces of information that you could use to answer each of these questions, create sub-answers, 3 of them, feed that into the context along with the user's question, and then provide a response. So you see you can get much more fine-grained about the answers that you provide by using retrieval augmented generation in general, but especially by using enhanced RAG. And as I mentioned, there's many different ways to do that. And all of this is a concern because, for example, this Stanford study that came out, it was ranking different research platforms according to their proclivity for hallucination. And when the study came out, it was pretty surprising that if you look at GPT-4 here, in terms of its hallucination rate, it's right around 0.5, close to it. So close to 50% of the time it would hallucinate. And the expectation then was that research platforms would not do that. But when the study came out, it was a bit of a bombshell because, as you can see here, Westlaw's solution was actually not too far off, just under 40% in terms of its hallucination rate. And Lexis, which actually had been out to the market less time than Westlaw, hallucinated less. And the same was true with Practical Law. So this really got everyone's attention, and how they really needed to pay more attention on the techniques that they're using to retrieve text and use retrieval augmented generation. Fact-checking and validating results still remains important, especially when you get output from AI. So just like with a human being, it would typically take the work product, go to an attorney, the attorney would review it, and then talk to the client about it. You have the same trust but verify loop with AI. It's not a magic oracle, as we've already established. So you'd need to run the AI output to the same attorney, have the attorney review it, and then ultimately, once it's verified, then you can communicate with the client about the impact of that. So the only reason I point this out is because sometimes when people think about AI, they think that it exists in a different type of world than what we normally do in the real world. And the workflow is exactly the same. We just need to give it as much skepticism as we do a colleague's work product. So how do we do that? First, we want to take the step of cross-checking with reliable sources. So if we get output from an AI, we want to trust that it's doing a good job, but at the same time, we want to verify it by cross-referencing it with, let's say, doing a Google search or searching on Westlaw. And if you looked on Google, you would want to look for actual sources of real cases. And once you've verified that, see if the cases comport with the output that you got from the AI or Lexis or any other reliable source of case information. You also want to work on refining your query. You don't want to just ask it once and then throw the baby out with the bathwater. You want to try it again and then compare the output that you get on the second and third attempt to what you initially got. And if you have an accurate standard of what the answer should look like, then you can compare it to that. Using multiple AI tools also helps. Instead of relying just on the output of one, you can try to get the answer from not only ChatGPT, but Claude Sonnet 3.5, maybe also from Google Gemini, and then take a look at how these different models are answering the question. But it still doesn't beat checking it against what you know to be true and also other reliable sources of information. And finally, consulting with colleagues about it. Really old-fashioned, but talking to people that may know more, maybe a senior partner who's dealt with the situation many times. They can also be a great sounding board for your review of the output from the AI. So just to recap, first off, and most importantly, mindset is everything. You just need to keep in mind that AI is a helpful assistant, and so it can make mistakes and you need to review it. We talked about prompt engineering, why it's important and how it works. Retrieval augmented generation and how it's a very promising and useful technique for getting the AI to be much more reliable in the output it provides. And finally, that good old-fashioned fact-checking and validating results is still extremely important and critical to working as professionals and retaining our supervision of work product. So that's prompt engineering and RAG. Thank you so much, and see you next time.